So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
"Give me your seat," Victoria Carter snapped, her voice cutting through the soft jazz of the restaurant like a serrated blade. "You don't need the view of the terrace as much as my senior partners do, and you certainly don't have anything interesting to say to them." Emily Carter didn't move. She felt the heavy, embossed invitation tucked into the side pocket of her purse, the thick cardstock a silent weight against her hip. Around the circular table at the Gilded Oak, the air grew thick with the sudden, awkward silence of 4 high-powered attorneys and their dismissive patriarch. The scent of Victoria's cloying, expensive Santal perfume drifted over, sharp enough to sting the back of Emily's throat. "Victoria, please," Emily said, her voice a low, steady contrast to her sister's sharp edge. "We're halfway through the appetizers." "And you've spent the entire time talking about a 5th-grade reading list," Victoria said, rolling her eyes as she signaled a waiter with a flick of her manicured wrist. She leaned in, the light from the crystal chandelier catching the oversized diamond on her finger, a gift to herself for a promotion she hadn't stopped talking about for 3 hours. "My partners at Price and Thompson didn't come here to hear about public school budgets. They came to celebrate a real career. Move. Now." Richard Carter cleared his throat, not looking up from his dry martini. He adjusted his silk tie, his expression one of bored endurance. "Do as your sister says, Emily. She's had a big week. You can sit on the end near the service door. It's not as if your outfit is doing the terrace any favors anyway." Emily looked at her father. He hadn't asked her once about her year. He hadn't asked why she had been flown to the capital last month, or why Grandma Martha had been calling her every night with a giddy, conspiratorial tone. To him, she was still the quiet one, the teacher who had settled for a life of chalk dust and modest paychecks, while Victoria chased the family's obsession with status. She felt the cold condensation on her water glass as she finally stood, the sound of her chair scraping against the marble floor echoing in the hushed room. She saw Joanna Price, the founding partner of Victoria's firm, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. Joanna didn't look impressed by Victoria's dominance. She looked like she was studying a specimen under a microscope. As Emily moved to the small, cramped chair near the kitchen entrance, Victoria slid into her place with a triumphant smirk. She didn't thank her. She simply turned her back, physically walling Emily out of the conversation. "So, Joanna," Victoria said, her voice pitching higher, performing for the table. "About the Excellence in Leadership Gala next Friday. I've already secured the front row table for the firm. It's the event of the season. Even the governor is rumored to be attending to present the Heroes Medal." "It is a significant night," Joanna replied, her voice clipped. She glanced toward Emily, then back to Victoria. "The guest of honor is a closely guarded secret this year." Victoria laughed, a brittle, entitled sound. "Well, whoever it is, they'll be lucky to have us in the front row. Speaking of which..." She turned slightly, looking over her shoulder at Emily, who was now sitting next to a busboy's station. "Emily, I realized I'm short-staffed for the firm's pre-reception. Since you're on spring break and clearly have nothing better to do, I've put your name down to help with the coat check and program distribution. It'll give you a chance to see how the other half lives for once." The table went silent again. Even the lawyers seemed to find the request a bridge too far. But Richard Carter just nodded. "Good idea, Victoria. It'll give Emily some much-needed exposure to a professional environment. Might inspire her to do something more with her life than grading papers." Emily felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, but it wasn't the heat of tears. It was the slow, steady burn of a sleeping lion finally opening its eyes. She thought of the letter in her bag, signed by the Secretary of Education. She thought of the Heroes Medal Victoria had just mentioned, the one currently sitting in a velvet box in Grandma Martha's safe, waiting for Emily's name to be engraved on the base. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A text from Grandma Martha. "The governor's office just confirmed the press list. They're calling you the national beacon. Are you ready for Friday, sweetheart?" Emily looked at Victoria's back, the expensive silk dress, the arrogant tilt of her head as she bragged about a world she didn't realize Emily already sat at the top of. "The coat check?" Emily asked, her voice deceptively soft. "And programs," Victoria added, not even looking back. "Wear something black and inconspicuous. Try to blend into the background. It shouldn't be hard for you." Emily reached into her purse, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy gold of a fountain pen Grandma Martha had given her when she'd won the national award. She could end this now. She could pull out the invitation and watch Victoria's face collapse in front of her bosses. But a sudden, sharp clarity took hold. A public reveal at a dinner was a spark. Friday night would be a conflagration. "I'll be there, Victoria," Emily said, a small, private smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I wouldn't miss that gala for the world. I think it's time everyone saw exactly who I am." Victoria snorted, waving a hand dismissively as she dived back into a story about her billable hours. She didn't notice the way Joanna Price's eyes narrowed, or the way Emily sat perfectly still, no longer the victim of the evening, but the architect of the coming storm. The next few days were going to be very interesting. Emily took a slow sip of her water, the cold refreshing against her tongue, as she began to mentally rewrite the speech she would be giving from the podium while her sister stood at the coat check, waiting for a thank you that would never come. The next morning, the medicinal hum of the faculty lounge's fluorescent lights felt like a countdown. Emily Carter sat at the scarred oak table, her fingers tracing the rim of a lukewarm paper cup. Usually, the scent of old chalk and industrial floor wax was grounding, a reminder of the life she'd chosen over the one her family demanded. Today, it felt like the quiet before a strike. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Richard Carter. Her father didn't do "good morning" texts. "Victoria tells me you're actually showing up on Friday. For God's sake, Emily, try to find something that doesn't look like you bought it at a church bake sale. This gala is about the firm's legacy. Don't make us look like we're sponsoring a charity case." Emily didn't reply. She felt the familiar, cold tightening in her chest, but she didn't let her hand shake. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a lesson plan. Inside was a legal notice from the holding company that owned the prestigious glass and steel tower where Victoria spent her days belittling juniors. The name on the deed was ME Heritage Holdings. To the world, it was an anonymous corporation. To Emily, it was Grandma Martha's final, silent lesson in leverage. "Another exciting day of grading." Emily looked up as Joanna Price walked in, clutching a stack of midterms. Joanna was one of the few who knew Emily was more than just a dedicated history teacher, though even she didn't know the full extent of the heritage Emily managed. "Something like that," Emily said, sliding the envelope back into her bag just as the door swung open with a violent, polished click. Victoria Carter marched into the lounge, looking like she'd stepped off a runway and onto a construction site. Her designer heels sounded like hammer strikes on the linoleum. She held a black garment bag over one arm, her nose wrinkled as if the smell of public education was physically painful. "I only have 5 minutes," Victoria snapped, ignoring Joanna entirely. She tossed the garment bag onto the table, nearly knocking over Emily's tea. "I felt bad after last night. Richard is worried you'll turn up in polyester, and quite frankly, I can't have my sister looking like the help while I'm trying to secure the Thompson account." Joanna's eyebrows shot up. "The help?" Victoria didn't even glance at her. She zipped open the bag to reveal a dress that was clearly 2 sizes too small and a shade of beige that screamed afterthought. "It's a few seasons old, but it cost more than your car, Em," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a performative kindness that was far more insulting than a shout. "Consider it an early birthday present, or a mercy killing for your wardrobe." Emily felt the sting of the insult, the way Victoria's cloying lily-scented perfume seemed to crowd the oxygen out of the room. She looked at the dress, then at her sister's smug, porcelain face. "I appreciate the thought, Victoria," Emily said, her voice unnervingly calm. "But I think I've already found something that fits the occasion perfectly." Victoria snorted, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. Don't be stubborn. You don't have the taste or the bank account to compete with the people who will be in that room. Marcus Thompson is going to be there. He's looking for a firm with stature. If he sees me dragging around a sister who looks like she's waiting for a bus, it reflects poorly on me. I wouldn't want to reflect poorly on you, Emily murmured. Exactly. Victoria leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Just stay in the shadows, Emily. Eat the expensive hors d'oeuvres, keep your mouth shut, and try to look like you belong. Though we both know you don't. With a final, dismissive pat on Emily's shoulder, Victoria turned and swept out of the room. The silence she left behind was heavy. Joanna looked at the beige dress, then at Emily. Are you really going to let her talk to you like that? Emily stood up, the heavy weight of the deed in her bag a comforting anchor. She thinks she's the one holding the guest list, Joanna. She's forgotten who actually owns the house. Emily stepped into the hallway and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Marcus, she said when the line picked up. It's Emily Carter. Yes, Martha's granddaughter. I'm calling about the gala on Friday. I think it's time we discuss the renewal of the firm's lease. And Marcus, I'd like to be added to the speakers list. She hung up, her gaze fixed on the calendar on the wall. 3 days. The countdown had officially hit 72 hours, and Victoria Carter had no idea that the charity case was about to hand her a 7-figure bill. 2 days later, the mahogany-paneled corridors of Thompson and Associates felt less like a law firm and more like a fortress. Emily Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office, watching the city pulse below. The scent of expensive furniture polish and old leather bound the room in an air of quiet, untouchable authority. It was a world her sister navigated with practiced arrogance, yet here Emily was, standing at the center of it. Marcus Thompson entered the room with a leather-bound folder tucked under his arm. He didn't look like the scrawny teenager Emily remembered from her grandmother's classroom. He looked like a man who moved markets with a single phone call. He set the folder on the desk with a heavy thud that echoed against the glass walls. It's all here, Emily, Marcus said, his voice carrying a deep, resonant respect. The Martha Carter Trust isn't just a collection of old schoolhouse deeds. Your grandmother was a visionary. She didn't just teach the city's elite, she bought the ground they stood on. Emily ran a finger over the cool, embossed seal on the folder. She felt a hum of electricity beneath her skin, a secret power that Victoria couldn't even fathom. And the lease for Carter and Associates. Marcus smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. The firm's headquarters at the Sterling Plaza. The lease expires at midnight on the night of the gala. According to the original charter Martha signed 40 years ago, the renewal isn't automatic. It requires the personal signature of the trust's sole executor. He paused, sliding a silver fountain pen across the desk. That's you. Emily picked up the pen. The weight of it was satisfying, a cold anchor in her hand. Victoria thinks she's the queen of that building. She spent 3 years remodeling the top floor into a monument to her own ego. She's about to find out she's been decorating a rental, Marcus replied. I've already alerted the board that a representative of the landlord will be attending the gala to discuss the future of the firm's tenancy. They're expecting a corporate suit. They aren't expecting you. The preparation was nearly complete. Emily tucked the documents into her bag, the paper crisp and sharp against her fingertips. She had 24 hours left to play the role of the invisible daughter before the mask came off. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere shifted from the quiet halls of law to the frenetic vanity of the Willard Hotel. The grand ballroom was a chaotic symphony of clinking crystal and the sharp scent of imported lilies. Emily arrived at the side entrance, hoping to coordinate with the catering lead, but the sound of a familiar, shrill voice stopped her cold. Victoria Carter stood in the center of the ballroom, her arms crossed over a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than Emily's monthly mortgage. She was berating a young event planner who looked to be on the verge of tears. I told you the centerpieces are too low, Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. This is a gala for the city's elite, not a bake sale. If I can see the person across the table, the arrangement is a failure. Fix it, or I'll ensure your agency never works in this zip code again." Richard Carter stood a few feet away, leaning against a marble pillar while scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up, his silence acting as a silent endorsement of his eldest daughter's cruelty. "Victoria," Emily said, her voice calm and steady. Her sister spun around, her eyes raking over Emily's simple denim jacket and canvas tote bag with visible physical revulsion. "What are you doing here, Emily? The charity cases aren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow evening, and even then, I'd prefer you use the service elevator." "I'm just checking on the arrangements," Emily replied, walking toward the head table. She reached out and touched the fine linen cloth, feeling the intricate weave beneath her hand. "It's a beautiful room. It would be a shame if something unexpected happened to the evening." Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that caused the event planner to flinch. She stepped into Emily's personal space, the cloying scent of her designer perfume filling the gap between them. "Nothing unexpected happens when I'm in charge. I've spent 10 years building the reputation of this family, while you've been busy playing saint in a classroom. Tomorrow night, I'm being named Partner of the Year. Dad is finally getting the legacy he deserves. You're just a footnote, Emily. A boring, beige footnote." Richard finally looked up, his gaze dismissive as it landed on his younger daughter. "She's right, Emily. Don't make a scene tomorrow. Just sit in the back, clap when you're told, and try not to remind everyone that you're a school teacher. It's embarrassing enough that we have to explain your career choice to the governor." The sting was there, but it didn't burn. Instead, it felt like fuel. Emily looked at her father, then back to the woman who thought she owned the world. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the edge of the lease agreement. The audacity of their arrogance was almost breathtaking. They were standing in a room she had authorized the payment for, in a city where her name carried more weight than their bank accounts, and they were treating her like a trespasser. "I'll be there," Emily said, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And I promise, Victoria, the evening will be unforgettable. You'll get exactly what you've earned." Victoria sneered, turning back to the trembling planner. "Whatever, just make sure you wash your hair. You smell like a public library." Emily turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. She didn't look back. She had the weapon. She had the ally. And in exactly 26 hours, the countdown would hit 0. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she pulled out her phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus Thompson. "Proceed." The following afternoon, Philadelphia was draped in a persistent, gray drizzle that blurred the edges of the skyscrapers. Emily Carter sat in a corner booth of a quiet cafe, watching the condensation drip down her glass of iced tea. The air here smelled of burnt espresso and damp wool, a stark contrast to the sterile, over-perfumed offices where her sister spent her days. Joanna Price looked across the table, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected a process server to burst in. As Victoria's lead paralegal, she had seen the inner workings of the Carter family's legal posturing for years. But the documents Emily had shown her 10 minutes ago had turned her face a ghostly shade of pale. "She has no idea, does she?" Joanna whispered, her voice trembling. "Victoria thinks the Carter Foundation is her personal piggy bank. She's already drafted the press release for tomorrow night. She's announcing a massive expansion of her firm, funded entirely by the Foundation's endowment." Emily leaned back, her expression unreadable. She felt the heavy weight of the original Foundation charter in her bag, the parchment thick and authoritative. She's always been fond of spending things she didn't earn. "She thinks because I chose to teach, I gave up my seat at the table." "She's planning to humiliate you, Emily," Joanna said, leaning closer. "I saw the seating chart for the gala. She put you at table 42. It's behind a pillar right next to the kitchen's swinging doors. She told the event planner you were distanced family who shouldn't be bothered by the photographers." A sharp vibration interrupted them. Emily glanced at her phone. Victoria's name flashed on the screen. She answered with a calm, steady hand. "Emily, darling," Victoria's voice dripped with a forced, sugary condescension that made Emily's skin crawl. "I'm just calling to make sure you found something appropriate to wear. Nothing too academic, and please don't bring those canvas bags of yours. I've told the board you're coming as my guest, so try to act like you belong in a room that costs 6 figures to rent. I'll be there, Victoria, Emily replied, her voice like silk over stone. But you should be careful about the guest list. Sometimes the people you try to hide are the ones who end up in the spotlight. Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Is that a threat? From a middle school teacher? Honestly, Emily, your delusions of grandeur are almost as pathetic as your bank account. Just show up, sit where you're told, and try not to embarrass the Carter name more than you already have by wasting your life in a classroom. I've redirected the honorary fund Grandma Martha set up for your literacy project into my own marketing budget for the firm launch. It's for the greater good of the family legacy, really. The rage spike hit Emily's chest like a physical blow, but she didn't let her breath hitch. Victoria had just admitted to raiding their grandmother's legacy for her own vanity. I hope you've enjoyed the view from your pedestal, Victoria, Emily said softly. Because the higher you build it, the further there is to fall. Tomorrow night will be exactly what you've earned, not a penny less. Whatever, just don't be late, Victoria snapped, and the line went dead with a metallic click. Emily looked back at Joanna, who was staring at her with newfound awe. The paralegal had seen Victoria bully everyone from junior associates to high court judges, but she had never seen anyone remain so unmoved by the venom. She's right about one thing, Emily said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table to Joanna. The Carter name is about to mean something very different in this city. Joanna scanned the document, a formal revocation of Victoria's signing authority, signed by Marcus Thompson and backed by the National Education Board. Her hands shook. This will dismantle her entire firm. If she doesn't have the foundation's backing, her creditors will move in within 48 hours. Marcus is already at the venue, Emily said, standing up. She adjusted her coat, her movements precise and deliberate. He's ensuring the AV system is ready for a very specific presentation. Victoria wanted a night the city would never forget. I'm going to make sure she gets her wish. As Emily stepped out of the cafe and into the cool evening air, she felt a strange, quiet peace. The countdown was no longer in days, but hours. She looked at the towering glass spire of the Carter Foundation building in the distance, glowing against the darkened Philly skyline. Victoria was inside that building right now, likely sipping champagne and rehearsing her victory speech, completely unaware that the ground beneath her designer heels had already turned to sand. Emily pulled her coat tighter, her heels clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion wouldn't just wake up. It would roar. The evening arrived with a suffocating humidity that made the polished marble floors of the Carter Foundation rotunda feel slick underfoot. Giant arrangements of white lilies stood in every corner, their scent thick and cloying, mixing with the expensive, metallic tang of the industrial air conditioning. Victoria stood at the center of the room, a vision in shimmering gold silk that probably cost more than a public school teacher's annual salary. She held a flute of vintage Krug, her laughter sharp and performative as she held court with a group of the city's most influential donors. No, Victoria snapped at a young server who offered a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Her voice carried across the marble, silencing the immediate circle of guests. She didn't bother to look at the boy, instead flicking her hand as if shooing a fly. I specifically requested the Wagyu tartare, not this. Whatever this is, do try to keep up or find a career better suited to your limited cognitive abilities. My father isn't paying for mediocrity tonight. The server's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson as he scurried away. Victoria didn't blink. She merely took a sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the room for more important targets. Emily stepped through the heavy glass doors, the cool air of the atrium hitting her skin like a benediction. She wasn't wearing the faded cardigan or the sensible flats Victoria loved to mock. Instead, she wore a midnight blue sheath dress, tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been poured onto her frame. It was a dress that didn't scream for attention, but commanded it once found. Around her neck sat a single strand of pearls, Grandma Martha's pearls, which caught the light of the crystal chandeliers with a soft, defiant glow. She felt the weight of the encrypted flash drive in her small silk clutch. It was a secret power, a cold piece of plastic that felt heavier than lead. Emily took a deep breath, tasting the expensive perfume and the underlying scent of lilies. She wasn't the mousy sister tonight. She was the storm. Dr. James Walker, the university's dean of sciences, caught her eye from across the room. He bypassed a line of local politicians waiting to speak to Richard and moved straight toward her. "Emily," he said, his voice warm with genuine respect. "I was hoping you'd make it. That paper you consulted on for the fellowship. Groundbreaking. We're already seeing the impact in the inner-city literacy programs." "Thank you, James," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "It's been a labor of love." Victoria noticed the exchange from 20 feet away. Her eyes narrowed, the gold of her dress seeming to flare with her sudden irritation. She marched over, her designer heels clicking a staccato rhythm against the stone that sounded like a countdown. "James, don't let my sister bore you with her classroom anecdotes," Victoria said, stepping between them and forcing James to take a half-step back. She didn't look at Emily, treating her like a piece of furniture that had been moved into the wrong room. "She's only here because Dad felt sentimental about family. Emily lives in a world of finger paints and alphabet blocks. We have real business to discuss, specifically the naming rights for the new wing." James looked uncomfortable, his gaze flickering between the two sisters. "Actually, Victoria, Emily's work on the—" "Is that blue?" Victoria interrupted, finally turning to Emily with a sneer. She reached out, fingering the fabric of Emily's sleeve with a dismissive tug. "Really, Emily? You look like you're attending a very expensive wake. Fitting, I suppose, for a career that's already dead. I told you to stay in the back, didn't I? You're bringing down the aesthetic of the entire rotunda." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't pull her arm away. She simply met her sister's gaze, her expression as unreadable as the marble walls. "I think the color is appropriate for the occasion, Victoria. It's a night for deep reflections, and I wouldn't worry about the aesthetic. The truth has a way of standing out, regardless of the wardrobe." Victoria let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The truth? You've always been so dramatic. Go find a corner and stay there. The presentation starts in 10 minutes, and I won't have you embarrassing me when I take the stage." As Victoria swirled away, her gold train sweeping the floor, Emily spotted Joanna Price standing near the bar. The woman looked pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of sparkling water. Joanna had been Victoria's right hand for years, the one who helped bury the bodies, metaphorically speaking. But tonight, Joanna wouldn't even meet Victoria's eyes. She looked at Emily instead, a silent, terrified acknowledgement passing between them. The traitor witness was in position. Emily moved toward the back of the hall near the AV booth. Marcus Thompson stood there, adjusting a headset. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a small, knowing smile. He tapped the laptop screen in front of him where a file labeled Carter Foundation Legacy sat waiting. "Everything is loaded, Miss Carter," Marcus whispered. "The system is slave to your remote. Whenever you're ready, the curtain goes up." "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "Is the backup server secure?" "Triple redundant." Even if they pull the plug on the main projector, the feed is already hitting the press's tablets via the local network. They'll see it whether Victoria wants them to or not. Emily nodded, her fingers brushing the silk of her clutch one last time. She looked toward the stage where Richard was now standing, adjusting the microphone. He looked proud, his chest puffed out as he prepared to introduce his star daughter. He had no idea that the foundation he had built on a legacy of dismissal was about to face its final audit. The lights in the rotunda flickered twice, the signal for the main event. A hush fell over the room, the clinking of crystal and the murmur of voices dying down into a heavy, expectant silence. Victoria began to walk toward the stage, her chin held high, the golden silk of her dress catching every spotlight in the room. She looked like a queen approaching her throne, completely unaware that the floor beneath her was already beginning to give way. Emily stepped into the shadows at the side of the stage, her heart beating with a slow, rhythmic precision. She watched Victoria take the microphone, the gold dress shimmering under the hot lights. "Welcome, everyone," Victoria began, her voice amplified and echoing through the hall. "Tonight, we celebrate the future of the Carter legacy, a legacy of excellence, of status, and of power." Emily reached into her clutch and wrapped her fingers around the remote. Her thumb rested on the button. The lion wasn't just awake. It was about to speak. Victoria's voice carried over the crowd with the polished resonance of a woman who had never known the weight of a consequence. Standing at the mahogany podium, she looked down at the sea of tuxedos and silk gowns, her smile as sharp as the diamonds at her throat. The scent of thousands of white lilies, cloying and heavy, filled the rotunda, mingling with the expensive musk of the city's elite. "My father taught me that the Carter name is a brand," she said, her gaze sweeping over the front row where Richard sat, his chest puffed with pride. "It is not a name for the weak or the common. It is not for those who spend their lives in dusty classrooms, settling for the mediocrity of a teacher's salary while the rest of us build empires." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter moved through the room. Emily felt the cold vibration of the remote in her palm, the metal casing slick with the humidity of the crowded hall. She stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, watching her sister's triumph. This was the second time tonight Victoria had used her public platform to sharpen her claws on Emily's life, but it would be the last. "I have spent the last year cleansing this legacy of those who would drag it down," Victoria continued, her voice rising in a crescendo of arrogance. "I have secured our future, protecting our assets from the incompetence of those who don't understand the value of a dollar. The Carter legacy is finally safe in my hands." Emily didn't wait for the applause. She pressed the button. The hum of the projector cooling fans suddenly spiked, a low drone that cut through the expectant silence. The celebratory montage of Victoria's legal victories flickered, turned to static, and then died. In its place, a series of high-resolution bank statements flooded the 30-foot screen behind her. The room went freezing. The only sound was the sharp, singular crack of a champagne glass hitting the marble floor in the back of the room. Victoria's face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The porcelain mask of her composure fractured, her eyes stretching wide until the whites showed all the way around, reflecting the flickering data on the screen like a horror movie projection. Her mouth, once curved in a sneer of absolute authority, hung open in a jagged, pathetic O, her breath hitching in audible, wet rattles. The vibrant color that had defined her triumph vanished, replaced by a gray, waxen pallor that made her look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. Her left eyelid began a frantic, rhythmic twitch, a physical manifestation of a mind failing to process the total annihilation of her reputation. "What is this?" Richard Carter shouted, standing up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he recognized the account numbers for the family trust, accounts that showed a balance of nearly zero. Marcus Thompson, standing near the stage, leaned in to squint at the screen. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming with the authority of the CEO he had become. "Those are embezzlement records. She didn't save the trust. She drained it." From the opposite wing, Joanna Price stepped into the light, holding a secondary tablet synced to the display. "And those are the forged signatures she used to frame her sister for the losses," she added, her voice clear and cold. "I have the originals, Victoria. You shouldn't have left your login active on my desk." The silence was replaced by a low, feral roar of whispers. The elite, who had been laughing with Victoria seconds ago, were now physically recoiling, shifting their chairs away from the stage as if her disgrace were contagious. Emily stepped out from the shadows, walking slowly toward the base of the stage. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The silence followed her like a loyal dog. She looked up at her sister, whose hands were now shaking so violently the microphone picked up the rhythmic thumping of her knuckles against the wood. "You spent so much time looking down at me, Victoria, that you forgot to check the ground beneath your own feet," Emily said, her voice carrying to every corner of the rotunda. "You said I didn't belong in this legacy. You were right. I don't belong in a house built on theft." Emily turned her back on the stage before the first security guard could even reach the podium. She didn't stay to watch the frantic scrambling or hear the pathetic excuses that were already beginning to spill from her sister's bloodless lips. She walked toward the heavy oak double doors, the weight of years of silence finally lifting from her shoulders. Behind her, the Carter legacy was screaming, but Emily was already gone. The echoes of the heavy oak doors closing hadn't even faded before the rotunda erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers and the sharp, electronic pings of 100 smartphones. Victoria Carter stood frozen on the stage, the white-hot glare of the spotlight making the sweat on her forehead glisten like oil. The silence Emily had left behind was far more terrifying than any shouting match could have been. It was the silence of a vacuum, and the room was rushing in to fill it with judgment. "It's a fabrication," Victoria finally shrieked, her voice cracking as it hit the high notes. She lunged for the microphone, her designer heels skidding on the polished wood. "My sister is a primary school teacher. She doesn't understand complex litigation or corporate structures. These documents are forged, likely by some disgruntled former employee she's conspired with." She looked toward the front row, searching for the familiar, comforting nod of her father. But Richard Carter didn't look up. He remained seated, his face a mask of ashen shock as he stared at the giant screen where the bank statements remained displayed. The red-inked transfers from the Carter Legacy Fund into Victoria's personal offshore accounts were undeniable. The smell of ozone from the overworked projector hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of expensive lilies that now felt like funeral flowers. "Victoria, stop!" a voice rang out from the side of the stage. Joanna Price stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing the submissive expression of a junior associate anymore. She held a sleek black tablet in one hand and a stack of notarized affidavits in the other. Behind her, Marcus Thompson stood with his phone raised, his thumb moving rhythmically as he managed a live stream that was already being shared by thousands. "The digital trail doesn't lie," Joanna said, her voice amplified by the room's acoustics. "I didn't just help Emily find these. I spent the last 6 months securing the original server logs you thought you deleted. Every keystroke, every authorization code, every penny you bled from the estate to fund your lifestyle, it's all here. And it's already been sent to the district attorney." The color drained from Victoria's face with a violent finality. Her skin didn't just pale, it seemed to physically erode under the weight of the overhead lights. It turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the heavy contouring on her cheekbones look like streaks of dirt against a tombstone. Her eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted wildly, losing their focus as the pupils dilated into pinpricks of pure terror. Her lower lip began a frantic, rhythmic twitching she couldn't suppress, and her jaw hung slack, exposing teeth that suddenly looked too large for her mouth. The arrogant tilt of her chin vanished, replaced by a frantic, bird-like jerking of her neck as she gasped for air that seemed to have turned into lead. She looked like a statue caught in the middle of a collapse. "Dad," Victoria whispered, her voice a pathetic ghost of its former authority. Tell them she's lying." Richard finally stood, but he didn't move toward the stage. He looked at the board members, then at the camera Marcus was holding, and finally at his eldest daughter. "You didn't just steal from the fund, Victoria," he said, his voice hollow. "You stole from me. You let me treat her like a pariah while you were the one rotting the house from the inside." He turned his back on her, walking toward the exit. The movement was a signal. The board members rose as one, their chairs scraping against the marble floor with the sound of grinding teeth. Dr. James Walker, the oldest member of the foundation, didn't even look at Victoria as he passed the stage. He simply leaned over to Marcus and said, "Make sure the police have a copy of that stream." Victoria collapsed onto the stage stairs, her silk dress bunching up around her knees. She was no longer the powerhouse lawyer. She was a child caught with her hand in the till, realized too late that the till was empty and the room was full of witnesses. Outside in the foyer, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of rain and damp pavement. Emily stood by the tall glass windows, watching the city lights. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Grandma Martha. The older woman reached out, her hand warm and steady as she squeezed Emily's arm. "You did it, child," Martha whispered. "You didn't just save the legacy, you saved yourself." "I didn't want it to be like this," Emily said, though her voice held no regret, only a profound sense of exhaustion. "Truth is like surgery," Martha replied. "It hurts, but it's the only way to cut out the rot." The heavy doors opened once more, and Victoria stumbled out, flanked by two security guards who were no longer acting as her escort, but as her keepers. She saw Emily and tried to surge forward, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You think you won," Victoria spat, her hair falling out of its perfect chignon. "You've destroyed the family name. You've left us with nothing. You're just as much a failure as you were when you chose that pathetic teaching job." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. She looked at her sister with a pity that was far more cutting than any insult Victoria had ever hurled. "The family name was already destroyed the moment you decided your greed was worth more than your integrity," Emily said. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the trembling woman. "You spent your life building a pedestal out of my silence. I hope you enjoy the view on the way down." Emily turned and walked toward the waiting car Marcus had called for her. Behind her, she heard the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs as a uniformed officer met Victoria at the bottom of the steps. The viral reckoning had only just begun, but as Emily looked at the dark horizon, she realized for the first time in years that she didn't have to look over her shoulder anymore. She was finally free, and the weight of the Carter legacy was no longer hers to carry. It was Victoria's to drown in. 6 months had passed since the blue and red lights of the police cruisers had stained the white marble of the Carter estate. The scandal that followed had been a slow-motion demolition, a viral wildfire that stripped the family name of its prestige and left only the charred remains of a legal dynasty built on sand. Emily Carter stood in the center of the newly renovated wing of the community center, the scent of fresh white paint and polished oak filling the air. It was a far cry from the stifling, perfume-heavy halls of her father's manor. Here, the air felt clean. She adjusted the simple gold pin on her lapel, a gift from her students, and looked out at the bustling room. Marcus Thompson was across the hall, shaking hands with donors and speaking passionately about the literacy program they had launched together. He caught her eye and offered a brief, respectful nod. He was no longer just a success story from her past. He was the board chairman of a foundation that actually meant something. The transition hadn't been easy. While the public had hailed her as a hero, the private cost had been a heavy, silent burden. She moved toward the window, watching the city below. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from her lawyer. The final sentencing for the fraud charges had been handed down. 2 days later, she found herself in a place she never thought she would visit, the State Correctional Facility's visitor block. The room smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a sharp, sterile contrast to the luxury Victoria Carter had once demanded as her birthright. When the heavy steel door hummed open, a woman emerged who bore only a haunting resemblance to the sister Emily remembered. Victoria sat behind the plexiglass, her designer highlights long gone, replaced by dull, mousy roots. She wore a shapeless, scratchy orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow her whole. There was no gold jewelry, no silk scarf, and no arrogance left in her posture. Her skin looked sallow under the buzzing fluorescent lights, and her hands, once perfectly manicured, were bitten raw at the cuticles. "You look like you're enjoying this," Victoria said, her voice raspy and stripped of its usual melodic condescension. She tried to sneer, but the muscles in her face seemed too tired to hold the expression. "I'm not," Emily replied, her voice steady and devoid of the anger that had fueled her for years. "I'm just here to drop off the last of the paperwork for the house. It's been sold. The proceeds are going into the restitution fund for the families you cheated." The color drained from her sister's face, leaving it a ghostly, translucent gray. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, went wide with a sudden, panicked realization. The house! You sold the estate. Where is Dad supposed to go? He's in a managed apartment in the city, she said. He's safe, Victoria, but the legacy you were so worried about, it's gone. There is no Carter name left to protect. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed, a small, choked sound escaping her throat. She looked down at her shackled wrists, her shoulders slumped in a way that signaled a total internal collapse. The realization that she had traded her freedom, her family, and her future for a pile of money that was now being used to pay back the very people she had mocked was a visible weight. She looked up, her eyes brimming with a desperate, ugly regret. "Emily, please, talk to the board. Tell them I—" "No," she interrupted, standing up. "You spent your life making sure I was invisible. Now you'll have to get used to being forgotten." She walked away as the guards signaled the end of the session. The metallic clang of the gate closing behind her felt like the final period on a very long, very painful sentence. Outside, the air was crisp with the arrival of autumn. Richard Carter was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against a modest sedan. He looked older, the sharp lines of his face softened by a humility that looked unnatural on him. He didn't look at her with the dismissive coldness of the past, but he didn't look at her with pride either. There was a hollow space between them that no amount of justice could fill. "She's holding up?" he asked, his voice thin. "As well as can be expected," she answered. They stood in silence for a moment, the cost of the last year hanging heavy in the air. She had won, but the family was a ghost. Grandma Martha had been the only one who understood that sometimes you have to burn the field to make the soil rich again. "I'm heading back to the center," Emily said, opening her car door. "Marcus is waiting for the final budget reports." Her father nodded slowly, a man lost in a world where his name no longer opened doors. "I'll see you Sunday then, for tea." "Maybe," she said, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to apologize for her hesitation. She drove away, leaving the gray walls of the prison in her rearview mirror. As she pulled into the parking lot of the community center, Joanna Price was walking out, carrying a stack of flyers for the upcoming gala. Joanna paused, offering a small, tentative wave, a gesture of someone still trying to earn back the trust she had discarded. Emily didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. She simply walked into the building she had built with her own hands, toward a life that belonged to no one but herself. She climbed the stairs to her office, the sound of her own footsteps firm and rhythmic on the hardwood. On her desk sat a framed photograph of her grandmother, smiling in front of a chalkboard. She sat down, picked up a pen, and began to grade the first essay of the semester. The title at the top of the page read, "The Definition of Integrity." She smiled, the weight finally gone, and began to read.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.